So as we begin, I would very much like to proudly acknowledge, as Colac Otway Shire does, the Gulidjan and Gadunabad peoples, past, present and emerging, as the traditional custodians of the Colac Otway region, where many of us today are meeting. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders, past, present and emerging. We recognise and respect the unique cultural beliefs, heritage and relationship to lands and waters of traditional custodians, which continue to be important today and into the future. We also pay respect to the many other traditional peoples in other parts of the state where participants are joining us from today. So I would like to thank in particular our VIP attendees, our councillors. Thanks very much, Councillor Costin, joining us early. I believe Councillor Margaret White will also be joining us today, and potentially also Mayor Kate Hanson and Councillor McCracken. So also thanks to our own division of council, which is the Environment and Infrastructure Division, led by Tony McGann, and our Acting Manager of Environment and Community Safety, Tony Galone, who've obviously been supportive and helped resource this project. I'd also like to welcome our network of environment officers and agency staff who we very closely collaborate with across the Barwon Southwest, and that's just what we're able to achieve by our collective endeavours and networking and help with projects like this is a really valuable thing. And as similarly with our land care coordinators, facilitators and members with whom we have a pivotal relationship, both in terms of community engagement and on-ground environmental works. I'd also like to welcome any members of SNMAR who may be in attendance today who were invited to the event. So now I'll briefly give you an outline of our program schedule. So we'll begin with Dora Novak, Colac Otway Shire's Environment Coordinator, who will introduce the inception of this project and why we felt there was a need and appetite for it in our communities. Then I'll provide a brief presentation on the booklet structure and content to give you a taste of some of the exciting ideas and projects suggested within it. Then we'll move to our keynote presentation, which will jointly be given by Michelle and Drew Shrug, which is all about gardening design principles and planning to give you a practical step-by-step understanding of how to approach habitat gardening in a manageable way. So they're going to give us a very brief introduction to what they're going to focus on before we get to the presentation itself. So I'll just give you a bit of their bio information, which is pretty fascinating and all-encompassing. So Drew and Michelle Shrug have worked as a team for the last 24 years, creating livable gardens and landscape in both the Northern Territory and Victoria. Michelle has qualifications in architecture and horticulture, and Drew shifted from farming and natural resource management into landscape construction, creating a combination that has seen them work in many different aspects of the plant world. Their back catalogue includes working for Greening Australia, the Charles Darwin University, the nursery and garden industry, garden festivals, corporate consulting, permaculture, community and school gardens, nurseries, revegetation, and their own successful landscape design and construction business. Currently, they're working from Gippsland, Victoria, passionate about plants and outdoor green spaces and the benefits they hold from all of us. So this obviously makes them extremely familiar with a lot of the issues that we confront in our Shire. In particular, many residents are currently grappling with the aftermath of bushfire, which has obviously been a really big issue in our Shire for quite some years of recovery. So Drew and Michelle, would you like to just briefly give us that intro into what you're going to focus on?
Okay. Hello. Yeah, good morning.
Hello.
I'm Drew. This is Michelle. We're professional landscape design construction team. We'll be joining you later to hopefully demystify the process of design. We hope to make it less overwhelming so that you can confidently just sort of begin the process of creating your own garden or your garden for wildlife, really. And we together think this is just a great initiative. So back to you.
See you later on.
Great, thanks very much. So after that, we'll have a Q&A for Drew and Michelle's presentation, which we hope you'll all engage in, and we'll talk about kind of how we'll conduct that when we get there. And then we get to see a very exciting recent example of what is possible in environmental leadership at a very local level from a project produced by the Waitawara Land Care Group. So we'll enjoy a brief video titled Our Backyards Are the Bush, which was produced this year by the Landcare Group through a community grant from Colac, Otway Shire. And Joanne Tyler, President of the Wider Wangara Landcare Group, will briefly introduce the video before we watch it. So that's our schedule for today. And now I'll throw over to Dora to speak to us about the background and inception.
Hello everyone, my name is Dora, as Liza said, and I'm the Environment Coordinator at Colac Otway Shire Council. It's great to see so many people join us for our launch. The booklet we are launching today aims to inspire residents to protect our flora and fauna by using Indigenous plants in their gardens and in turn create habitat for wildlife. Gardens of all shapes and sizes can be wonderful places for our local plants and animals. For those of you that might not be local to us, Colac Otway is located in Victoria's southwest. The Shire is very diverse. It contains 4 bioregions with volcanic and Ramsar lakes and volcanic plains to the north, a hinterland of forests and the Otway Ranges, which is a very significant protected area within our Shire, as well as the Great Ocean Road coastline in the south. Development of educational resources and community engagement is central to the work we do in our environment unit and aligns with the targets and objectives of our environment strategy to protect and enhance our environment, as well as provide community engagement and education to understand our Shire's unique and important biodiversity values. Historically, we've probably been more focused on what we call the baddies, the weeds. We do a lot of work on public and council managed land on weed control and impacts of pollution, and impacts of increased urbanization. So we've been long looking for an opportunity to do something in the space of the goodies and what you replace those baddies with that we remove, and how you create really valuable habitat and biodiverse landscapes within your own gardens. It's exciting to have the opportunity to guide our communities in a positive direction through this resource. As Liza will take you through the contents, but it has some really valuable components like what to replace invasive plants with, or environmental weeds or garden escapees that you would find in your garden, and also how this kind of work enhances habitat corridor creation and providing refuge and stepping stones for our wildlife through our urban spaces that are, through urban growth, are expanding more and more. We are the first regional council in Victoria to develop this kind of booklet, and it has been developed over several years, probably mostly really over the last 2 years, but the years of experience and talking to our community certainly shaped what we think is a really localized and useful resource for all of you, full of useful ideas that you can implement in your own backyards. Thanks, Liza.
Thanks a lot, Dora. Okay, so now let's get into it and actually give you a sneak peek of the booklet. As I said, it's a shame we couldn't be giving you the copies today, and we actually had a bit of a discussion around whether we would ever print hard copies, but we thought with this kind of resource, it's so useful to have out in your garden with you while you're planting, or to take out with you if you need to do a bit of ID for weeds or for Indigenous species, which we're going to encourage you to get out there with the Indigenous Species Guide into our local gardens and reserves and really immerse yourself with that. So yeah, so we went the option of printing it, but we have an online version that we'll post in the chat towards the end of the session, so you can access an electronic copy as of today. So I'll just launch my presentation, hopefully smoothly. And apologies, I have a bit of a lag on getting my screen share to come up, but should happen shortly. So there it is, our garden for wildlife, local plants for native wildlife. We really wanted to keep the focus on that habitat gardening, the benefits of habitat gardening, and yeah, keep it on what not just the beauty of the plants in themselves or the gardens you could create, but that habitat focus. So as Dora had already outlined, we've got 4 significant bioregions in our Shire, and the booklet opens with a section that's very locally focused to give that real understanding. And while this might seem kind of technical, having something like that about, talking at your bioregions level, we don't dwell on it in the booklet, but we just thought it was useful to have an overview and sort of present an introduction into the diverse range of vegetation types that we have in our Shire, so that those interested in thinking of their garden sort of at that level and the way it fits into the broader landscapes, they can be pointed towards tools to help them do so, such as the state government's Nature Kit tool, which is really fantastic for getting information at a local level about both those vegetation types that you might find having naturally occurred in your area, and also the species lists and abundance in your area and potential. So then we feature some of our beautiful open spaces. These are a list featuring some of our environmental reserves. We actually have in the order of 20 that we protect. Council managed for their strong biodiversity values. So we thought it's a fantastic way to understand what species will thrive in your area, to get out into these local reserves and see in what conditions they thrive, what the structure of all of the different species, how they interact. So that's a great way to start before you even begin planning your garden, by immersing yourself and seeing actually how beautiful it is, and what diversity of wildlife will be attracted to an area with some good diversity and layering of plants. So I thought I'd just feature today 2 of them because our little selection there does try to encompass a whole range of areas across the Shire, right from one of our northernmost reserves, which is Lake Corangamite Nature Reserve, which is on one of the very few public access points to Lake Corangamite, which is a Ramsar listed lake, so therefore of international significance. And I featured it here for a couple of reasons, but also because just around the corner when the weather turns, it's a fantastic place to visit in the spring because of its amazing bird life and its general beauty. It's also had some fantastic revegetation work done on what was a pretty denuded reserve at one point by a collective effort of a very active local group led by the LV tree planters, council support and resourcing, and also school groups. So then the other one I've got featured, if it's going to change slide for me. Is Marengo Flora Reserve. So at the very opposite end of the Shire, 7 kilometres outside, 3 kilometres I believe, outside Apollo Bay, and it is quite a spectacular area, equally a fabulous treat in the spring with its abundance of native orchids, and it's a very diverse site. So you walk from open sandy plains into dense coastal heath, and it's quite a spectacular site. Another reason I feature these 2 reserves is because they are fantastic habitat locations. So there's known to be the very endangered Lake Corangamite water skink there on the left, up at the lake's edge, and then the southern brown bandicoot has recently been sighted at Marengo Flora Reserve. And there's also evidence nearby of long-nosed potteroo activity. So that's pretty exciting. And you never know, I mean, they're both pretty elusive species, but you might be rewarded with a visit or a sighting of them if you visit some of these reserves. So the next part of our locally focused content features some of our unique wildlife to just kind of highlight actually how incredibly diverse what we have in this beautiful region of species are, but we've tried to cover a mix. This was to me the hardest section of the booklet, how you pair down with the beautiful abundance and diversity of species, types and character that we have. What do you pick, what to feature? So we've tried to go for, as you see, a real mix of species there, but it certainly doesn't cover everything. And we had quite robust discussions about some of the exclusions. But yeah, we thought it was useful to highlight not only some of the conservation status of these animals, but their threats, many of which are domestic animals, mouse traps, things like that. So it's certainly worth keeping those things in mind in terms of your own garden management if you are creating a habitat garden. Then I just wanted to feature another species, critically endangered, the golden sun moth, because everybody loves our butterflies and moths. So I just thought that was kind of a lovely thing to highlight. It enjoys the north part of the Shire, and particularly the grassy plains. So then we moving beyond our very locally focused features into the garden design. And I'm not going to dwell on this because that's obviously the focus of Michelle and Drew's presentation, and you will be able to go into detail in the booklet in your own time. But I just wanted to highlight the value of garden layers for a habitat garden. A lot of our traditional formal garden styles have been to exclude and divide, and that unfortunately is not beneficial to wildlife in terms of their need for connectivity, shelter, places to forage, and the whole wealth of diverse life that is fostered by things like left fallen logs, leaf litter on the ground for all of our invertebrate species, etc., and also soil health. And in that vein, I love this picture of this lovely barn owl emerging from its hollow. That part of that sort of mess is good principle, and it doesn't mean that you have to commit your entire garden to that, but is to leave things to naturally disintegrate because they are incredibly valuable to habitat. So then we have I love this part, it's what we've called our recipes section, which is how you, for different types of species, can simple tips to enhance the likelihood of those species visiting your garden. So as you see here, I've featured the butterflies one, and you'll see the key in the bottom corner there of that butterfly symbol. That will come into play later when we get to our garden guide. So then I've just featured another couple that we have in there, moving through the kind of order of species, and we thought it was important with there's a lot of awareness and now obviously of the importance of native bees. So we've got our invertebrate pollinators section in there, and then moving into our birds and up to our larger species. Then this section of recipes also has some projects in it that you can construct in your own yard, including this much loved activity for the whole family of creating a frog pond with some guidance around that. Then our middle section is planting and maintenance. I'm also not going to go into that because it's, your step-by-step guide, which is hopefully highly accessible and useful to people. But it's, your more rudimentary process-based way to keep your plants thriving. So then the crux, well, I guess the bulk of the booklet is devoted to our local Indigenous plant guide. So this is the introductory page where we introduce, again, the keys that have come from our recipes that we list with every species, and with most of them, it's an abundance of these species that will be attracted. And so we've just got that simple key so you can reference what species are likely to be attracted by introducing that into your garden. Then we introduce the plant categories that we cover in the species guide, working through from our creepers and climbers, ground covers, grasses and tussocks, ferns, small shrubs, large shrubs, up to large trees. And then we've also added aquatic and a semi-aquatic category. So many people have those wet patches in their gardens or want to plant native species at pond edges, etc. But these we've got in a banner under the other categories. So they're incorporated essentially into the other categories within the guide. So here's a couple of pages of example for you of the plant guide, which is 34 pages long. So there's quite a lot of species able to be featured there. And then as you see there with the key, you see how many, for example, the running postman attracts. And we've tried to give you an example of both the form on the left there in the image and the close-up of its flower head, so you can get a sense of it, both what it will look like potentially for much of the year and in its kind of showy best. Then we have our invasive plants and garden escapees section, which is just several pages because we have quite a few weed devoted resources. But we thought it was really useful to have this replacement plant, because what I've chosen to feature here are two of our, very stubborn and traditionally much loved in the garden plants that we thought trying to give people an option, so it's not just this idea of, I've loved the way that the agapanthus, say, lines my driveway. Well, the structure and form of your black anther flax lily can replicate that and be an equally beautiful and robust alternative. Similarly with pampas grass, I've included that because that's been a real issue these past 12 months, and red fruit sausage, which is unbelievably effective for attracting wildlife, is a great alternative there. So that's what those look like. And then there's a checklist at the end of the booklet to remind you of the various elements that are in it, so you can kind of slowly work away and tick them off without it being too daunting. And that's the content. I'm just going to unshare. Okay, so we'll move now to Drew and Michelle's presentation. I don't think you need any further introduction, so take it away.
All right, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Look, Michelle and I are about to take you on a step-by-step through process of the designing a garden. Michelle is the designer. So she's going to lead it mostly, and I'll sort of back her up where I need to. We're lucky enough that a recent clients let us use one of their gardens as an example. So we're mostly focusing on that because it was basically focused on all the same principles. Our process that we're going to go through is quite detailed. You may feel that much of it's not relevant to you. Let it go. It doesn't matter. But we wanted to cover it because we do it for a living. We wanted to be as clear as we possibly could with the time that we had. The booklet's fantastic, and I think really utilising the booklets with basically the process we put you through will put you in a really good position for wildlife in your garden, and also keeping you happy because it's your garden. You want it how you want it. So, but none of what we say is compulsory. It's all pretty flexible. And we'll roll on. All right. So,
okay, I'm going to have a go at putting this PowerPoint presentation up. A lot of the photos that we've used in this presentation have been taken by ourselves in gardens that we've constructed, and other and the other photos are.
Let's get our PowerPoint. That was it. You there?
So hopefully you can all see that.
And hopefully you can all hear us. All right.
Yep, we've got it. Thank you.
Excellent.
Great, Liza, thank you.
So, Michelle, why wouldn't you just go to your local nursery and buy some Indigenous plants and then plant them in your yard?
Sounds like the simplest way to deal with that, and trying to get wildlife attracted to your garden. But one of the reasons that design is an important process to go through is that it helps you manage things like the amount of time that you've got to spend in your garden. So by designing your garden, you can reduce the amount of maintenance. All of us have busy lives. I mean, I'd love to spend every hour of every day in my garden, but that's just not going to happen. It also helps you to avoid the heartbreak of putting in plants that just don't survive. Gardens that have to be dug up because they've been planted on top of an easement, for example, that needs to be accessed, or even gardens that just don't get used because they've not been designed with use in mind. And you can also save yourself quite a bit of money by getting it right the first time.
The first time, and that's a big thing. Yeah. All right.
That being said, plants are fairly fickle beings, and no amount of planning will eliminate all variables.
So we've got before and after here. Go through this with us.
So the photos on the top row are the before photos from this particular garden we're going to use as our main example.
Pretty stunning location by the look of it.
Yeah, gorgeous views over the Gippsland Lakes. got my cursor here, the very ordinary little, what was once a holiday shack sitting up on top of the hill, a few sheds and stuff, and it was sort of very overgrown in the backyard. And what we ended up with after quite a lengthy design process and lots of swapping and changing is the after photos down the bottom. So it sort of gives you a bit of an idea of how you can go from one thing to another. It took about 12 months.
It did take a long time. All right. So you've got like a recipe as such.
Yeah, so designing's a bit like following a recipe. First of all, you assemble your ingredients, which is basically the process of surveying and analysing your site. Then you mix them all together, which is when you start incorporating design elements, your concepts and ideas. The seasoning part of it is when you develop the plants and refine them and research them and add in all those little details. Cooking is the construction process.
That's what I do.
And the garnishing is kind of the finishing touches where you sort of put in things like little water bowls and decorative touches and the plants. Really.
It's your plants, really, and that's the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
So.
And then the eating part is actually getting to enjoy and use your garden. So we'll take you sort of through the steps in a bit more detail.
All right. Looks like you've got some existing plans that you need to try and get hold of. Now, if you've had a fairly recently built house, your plans should be obtainable through council. Is that right?
That's right. So as all building plans have to be lodged with council, if you don't have a copy of them, it's a really good sort of first port of call is to see if you can obtain a copy from your council.
They may not have them, but
most plans are digital now, but before plans were digital, the poor council had to store a hard copy of all those plans.
Yeah.
A lot of councils clearly haven't got the resources to be able to have them digitised. And I've sort of come across examples where a whole heap of files got lost through fire. So sometimes they just aren't available, particularly with older dwellings.
Older dwellings.
Up the top here we've got a copy of title. So if you're the owner of a property, you're entitled to this document, which will give you.
Sorry, Drew and Michelle, I just had to do a mute all because of interference, so you'll just need to unmute again.
No.
Hey, were you there?
Sorry to interrupt like that. Yeah, sorry. I just it was getting kind of bad interference on the line.
Okay.
Yep, we can hear you. It's just that the screen's gone away from your presentation.
There we go.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
That's
all right. No worries.
So if you're the owner of the property, you have access to that through the land titles office, basically.
So if you can't get a copy of plans with your house on it, you should be able to get a title plan. But what if you can't even get that?
Well, you can get your title plan.
Yeah.
You're entitled to that, and they are available.
Yeah.
But if there's nothing that you can get your hands on of existing plans for your house on the block, you've got a couple of options. This is a full survey plan, which is like gold. It's the best thing you can ever have, really, but they cost money. And luckily, the clients that we had, they were surveyors and civil engineers, so they just did that themselves. So a full survey plan will show your existing vegetation, which is marked in green there. The house, which is in the middle, there's some sheds up in the back corner. You can see all these contour lines along here. So contours are, for those who don't know, are lines that are drawn on a map that connect points of equal elevation above sea level. Basically meaning if you walk along a contour line physically, you'll be staying at the same elevation. So each one of these lines represents a drop or a rise in elevation from sea level. So this is quite a steep slope down here, and as you can see, it sort of flattens out there. There's no lines where the house is. If you can't get copies with your house on, what you need to do is do a full measure up yourself. And that's when you need a few little tools.
But it's not that hard.
It's not hard. So basically a notepad, a tape measure. We have a measuring wheel because we do a lot of it. Get out there and start measuring everything. So you sort of just need to position your house on your block. So you find your front corner, take a measurement down the side till you're level with the front of your house and start from there. You can see I make these sort of funny little scribbles and then just measure everything. I try and get as many measurements as possible when I go on site because I don't want to have to go back to check it out. But with your own garden, you know, if you've missed something, you just go outside and measure it. So that's a fair bit simpler.
So you mark existing vegetation and everything?
Yeah, so you mark down everything. Things like paths and driveways, walls and fences, gates, services, where your gas bottle is, where the water comes into the property, switchboards and meters because they need to be accessed, and your existing vegetation, absolutely. And the thing with the existing vegetation is to hopefully get it identified or identify it yourself. Take a note of the size of things, health and condition, and the habitat value. So this is where your mobile phone, your camera is really handy. So use that to take lots of reference photos to remind you of the plants you see around you and all those things. But once again, you know, your own garden, you can go back outside and remind yourself at any time. But in terms of for ourselves doing someone else's garden, I just take thousands of photos.
Trust me, she takes thousands of photos. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Topography. This goes back a little bit to your contours.
It does, and it's actually much more important to get some information about your slope if you've got a steep slope or if the slope varies. Even flat sites have to drain to somewhere, and so it's a useful thing to have a handle on, particularly if it's very steep.
And it can be an expensive process. Obviously, steps and retaining walls and things that you need to take into account. And if it's too steep to walk down and you want to get there, then you're going to have to do something about it at the end, really. It won't take long to work that out. So how do you draw it up? Here we go.
Okay, so probably the simplest thing for someone wanting to do their own garden design is to get your hands on an A3 graph paper with the 2mm squares, because that enables you to work at a scale of 1 to 100, which is an easy scale to work with, as you can use a standard ruler, because at 1 to 100, 1 centimetre on the paper equals 1 metre on the ground. So it's actually a very easy scale to work with. And also the A3, because most suburban-sized gardens will fit on A3 at that scale of 1 to 100. And if you've got a bigger garden, you just do it in sections. You might do the back garden on one sheet and your front garden on the other sheet, or you might not even be doing your whole garden. So,
and is that the Otway
it's
panther?
a good. Oh yeah, of course it's the Otway panther.
Keeping it at 1 to 1 like this, 1 centimetre, 1 metre, makes it very easy on site to be able to, well, it mitigates risk in getting things wrong, because when you're dealing with 1 to 50,000 or whatever, but if you've got a simple scale, it just makes it easier to keep it clear in your head where you're at when you're designing and when you're constructing.
Okay, so this is the sort of base plan I end up with because I don't use graph paper, and that shows all the information that I would gather in a site survey. So I've got the boundaries that are here that have been determined by the title plan. Then I've got the house marked in position, some sheds down the back. You'll notice here that the shed seems to be across the boundary, which in fact it was. So part of this shed was on the neighbour's property. Luckily, they're friends with their neighbours and they didn't have an issue with that.
Well, we moved them in the end, I think. Yeah.
No, those were the ones that stayed.
Oh, okay. We moved the other one.
So we've got the major trees marked in, areas of existing vegetation. There was a seat over here. This black dot here was a lamp post, which came from the Victorian Houses of Parliament originally.
Yeah, don't know
so
that.
You'll see that in a few photos later on. So basically, and I've got a water meter here, and that's where the power comes into the property. And so there's a lot of different bits and pieces to put in. I think that was a hot water service, and where there's taps, and that was a hot, anyway, it doesn't matter, air conditioner, that sort of thing. So you mark everything in on your base plan.
So they're all the services that you can find, and hard spaces that aren't going to change. And
this plan's what you'll use to sort of do overlays of different ideas that you have. So what I do then is make a few copies of this plan so that I can start marking onto it other things that I want to take into consideration while I'm designing.
So that's your blank canvas, so to speak.
It is, yes. So things that you want to consider are views, for example. So this garden has spectacular views out on this side, and we certainly didn't want to completely block those. Didn't mind the idea of actually looking through tree trunks at the view, which is quite a nice way to frame an expansive view. So we wanted to keep those views, but we also wanted to block views into the garden along the sides and also from the street, because it was quite exposed from the street. And also, it's not just views that you're potentially screening, but you can also be screening things like road noise and dust and other pollutants. Views from inside the house. So this is where the bedroom is, the master bedroom, and they wanted to be able to sit up in bed having a coffee and look out along this yellow area here that I've marked in, right across the lake. Views from outside into the garden. So we're sort of planning on screening off down in this area here.
So what have you got here? You've got circulation of, is this pedestrian traffic or?
So this is pedestrian traffic and vehicles. So we've got vehicles need to come in here off the street, and the wish is to create a visitors parking area as well, because there was none at this house. So you end up with visitors' cars up behind you and there's no on-street parking. And then this is your pedestrian access around the place. So they wanted to go out to this particular point. There's a little track that ends up going down the hill. Whoops. Oh. Ends up going down the hill to the beach. Then we've also got getting from the outdoor deck down into the garden, and then access from the house down to the shed where they keep their firewood and that sort of thing. So
you'd include things like getting firewood to the shed in this, and the man who needs to change the gas bottle?
Yeah, so you need to make sure that you take note of things like that. So, you know, gas bottle out here, so there clearly needs to be access all the way around from the street.
Yeah. What about your dog?
Well, if you've got a dog, I mean, some dogs I know love to just hang out at the front door, and they love to be able to go backwards and forwards along the boundary. And if you've got a dog that likes doing that, you can try and block it with plants, but they'll still end up making a track.
Oh, they will.
So it's kind of nice to just keep that in mind while you're designing, so that you don't get disappointed when your dog makes a track through the middle of your garden.
And your kids.
And your kids.
Yeah. So.
And the other thing with circulation is thinking about how the wildlife enters your garden. So in this particular case, I mean, they came in from all directions, but one of the main entrances for wildlife into this garden was along this boundary, which was heavily vegetated on the other side. So by creating links from that side of the fence to this side of the fence, the hope is that it'll encourage the wildlife to come further in. And then they also came from this sort of wild area on the escarpment.
Down the hill.
Up the hill. So by placing, by creating a sort of a wildlife-friendly habitat at the top of the hill here, we've managed to encourage more of the animals who stayed down here to come up and be in the garden. Climate and microclimate. So you can get an awful lot of information about your local climate from the Bureau of Meteorology, the BOM data, which is available online. And, you know, long-term residents will certainly know a lot about their climate anyway. Microclimate, on the other hand, looks at how the weather affects smaller spaces and your own backyard, in fact, in this case. So what we're looking at there is making notes of things like, this is in the blue, things like winds and, what am I doing? Go back.
Yep.
What? Don't touch anything. So making note of winds and breezes, and there's a difference between wind and breeze. Wind is generally something that's fairly annoying.
You'd want to screen it.
And you may want to screen it, and you can sort of have things like a wind tunnel effect where the air pressure builds up around one side of the house and then shoo, tunnels down the side. Whereas a breeze is something that you might want to encourage, particularly in summer when you want to be able to sit in a nice spot and have a gentle breeze. Sun paths are an interesting thing. There's a few new apps on the market that you can have a go, but none of them have really been proven at this stage. But
honestly, the best way to do this is to live in the place for a year or so to get
watch.
a handle on it. The other one there too is like frosts are huge. You can lose your whole garden in a good frost, and you mightn't get it every year. Not a real doozy like we seem to have. Probably every 4 years we'll get a really, really, really cold season. That's something worth talking to your nurseries about when you go to plant, because they know and they'll be able to advise you on the past history. If you're not a local, it's really hard to get a good grasp on what the seasonal changes are like, and whether it's a mild year or whether it's been quite a cold year.
Mm. The other thing that microclimate can help you with is when it rains, where does it go? Do you end up with damp spots in your garden? And do you want to keep those, or do you need to drain them away because they're causing issues near buildings, for example? You'll find your cool, shady areas. You'll find your hot, exposed areas. With buildings and fences, there's also reflected light and heat, particularly off light-coloured surfaces. And then, of course, I've sort of included in this microclimate section the bushfire issues that we all have. And we've got the same thing down in the East Gippsland Shire. So rebuilding after the bushfires in 2019 has, meant that bushfire overlays have become a very important issue for people to get a handle on when they're working with their gardens. The CFA has actually put out an excellent resource which is available online for designing for bushfire, garden design for bushfire. So
certainly worth a read. In fact, that probably should be compulsory.
It's pretty much compulsory, yeah. I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of observing your garden for a full cycle of seasons, this is where your phone camera is also really handy. Is to just go out there and maybe pick a day a month and take a series of photos from the same places in your garden that will then show you over time what the sun does. So where your shadows are, where your shady spots are, they'll be different in summer than what they are in winter.
Hundreds of photos, trust me.
Hundreds of photos. And while you're out there, you can also photograph other things, like when some trees lose their leaves, flowering times of different plants, any insects and wildlife, etc., that you notice in the garden at the time, you can sort of take note of those. And the other thing I'm a particular lover of bulbs, these wonderful little surprises that pop out of the garden at various times of the year. And if you've moved into an established garden as a new resident in a house, you won't know where all that stuff is until you've gone through a full cycle of seasons. So sometimes if you don't know, you'll be digging away and come up with this shovel full of bulbs. So doing observations for a full cycle, you should get to know where all that stuff is in your garden.
Wildlife.
Yeah.
This is one of my favourites. Look, it sort of reflects a little bit on the climate and microclimate from the last one, and Michelle's emphasis on recording data and basically watching. It's a lot of it's observation. I love watching. I just always notice when there's bees or native bees in our garden, and I love it. I just love following them and watching them, and it's surprising where just one plant will bring thousands of bees for 2 or 3 weeks. when nothing else seems to be. And it's a key to the success of your garden, I think. What have we got here, Mish?
So what we're talking about with this slide is, observing what already visits your garden. When does it visit? What time of the year? What time of the day? What does it do when it's visiting? Is it feeding? Is it socialising? Is it collecting nesting materials? Is it eating all your fruit? Is it destroying your vegetable garden? So which shrubs are visited? Do you have a pile of rocks down the back that's a home for skinks? Just making note of all those sorts of things. So you're not disrupting something that's already doing a good thing. So bits and pieces. So this is where you make a bit of a list of all the other stuff you've got that you'd like to incorporate in your garden somehow. So things like, bird feeding stations or bird baths, and nesting boxes is another thing that are quite popular down here, and also for bats, micro bat nesting boxes. You can see one of the photos there, there's some old terracotta pipes. They were actually dug up as we were doing some excavation in this particular garden. So they've ended up getting used as a garden feature. Things like the branches that we kept because they were really interesting shapes, and they've been incorporated into part of the garden. There were some recycled bridge timbers that they had that have been used in the garden. That Christmas present plant that someone gave that you've never had any idea really where to put. Now's your chance. Do the research and find a home for it. So,
and it is amazing, those terracotta pipes. I dug those up. It was an old septic, and they've turned out, they just look great, especially in that light. And the old terracotta pots is awesome. We're clearly, you can see by the photos, we're fairly big on recycling and reusing and repurposing. So that's one aspect. And also just little things like these terracotta pipes or the pots. It's great homes, great habitat for wildlife, and you can make a log look funky. You don't have to make it look like rubbish. So although those have just stacked there, but just something to think about. What's on the ground?
Well, this is mostly your bit, true, but evaluating your soil type is a really simple process, and that's been outlined in the Wildlife Garden book, Garden for Wildlife book, and it's well worth doing. And cheap pH test kits are also available, and useful if your plants don't seem to be thriving.
Again, talk to the locals, talk to your nurseryman, talk to your neighbour about what works where and what the soil type is. If you're a local, you're probably pretty familiar with your soil, but a pH test is so easy, and the soil type test in the Garden for Wildlife booklet's ideal. I wouldn't get overwhelmed with the complexity of soil science at this stage. Probably the most important point here I'd make is one is the dial before you dig, which is pretty much compulsory before you stick a shovel too deep in the ground. But on top of that, I would say that the dial before you dig will give you a lot of information, but mostly be on the outside of your fence, on the public area ground, on the verge. So you're still going to have to tread gently. If in doubt, ask your local electrician and your local plumber. Is going to solve most of your problems. So your plumber will be able to work out for you where your gas and water go, and your sparky will be able to tell you where the electricity comes into your house, and from where. So you can get those pretty. And they're the two main ones. The other one I don't like hitting is sewage. Not one of my favourites. And again, your plumber should be able to direct you to where that goes and where the easements are, etc., etc. The other one on top of that is if you are on a new subdivision where there's where the ground has been literally demolished and put back, often they'll put clay on the top. You just need to have a really good look at what you're left with there. That is a bit of a trap for a lot of people, but it's important but ask your neighbours, ask your nurserymen. If in doubt, take a bucket to the nursery of your soil and ask them to have a look, see what they reckon. They'll give you a pretty good idea. There's nothing wrong with asking.
So demolition, it's a fairly forceful word, but basically it means just getting rid of the stuff that you don't really want there. So that can be anything from removing or relocating or pruning existing plants. And that can be for a lot of reasons. They may be unhealthy. They may be so old, like, say, acacias have got a lifespan of about 15 years. Once they get to 12 or 13 years, they start just dropping branches. And if you've got an old acacia, you're probably better off to remove it and make that space available for another plant rather than keep it and then find out you've got to trample all over your brand new garden in 3 years' time to get rid of something that's causing issues. This garden had a couple of palm trees that we relocated to another garden.
Yeah.
And a couple of sheds that were relocated to other people's places. And a little tiny garden shed that just got moved around to another side of the house.
We reused everything, literally everything. That turned out quite well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So making note of all those sorts of things that you can reuse.
All right. How do we use your garden? I like this one. This is one of my favourite parts because it's the practicality of your garden and what you want to get out of it.
So using the garden, you've now collected a whole heap of physical information about your garden. So then what you need to do is go, okay, well, what do we want to do in the garden? What do we currently use our garden for? What would we like to use the garden for? Is there a difference? Is the reason we don't use the garden because we haven't got these spaces there? So
is there something in your garden that you need to protect, like a possum with his nest in his tree, or a particular plant that attracts heaps of birds or bees that you really want to work right around? And you need to keep those right at the front of your mind, to be honest.
Yeah. And then ask yourself questions like, who and what uses my garden? So kids, pets, other animals. Do I want to produce food in the garden? So do I need to make space for a vegetable garden, or do I want to have fruit trees or herbs, bush food for the animals? How much time do I want to spend looking after my garden? And this comes back into the conversation again. You really need to think, how much time have I got? Have I got half a day every week? Have I got half an hour every day? Have I got all day every day? In which case you can have a lovely high maintenance garden. But you need to get a bit of a handle on what you are able to maintain, how much time you've got to spend looking after your garden. So then we get on to garden styles. Now, gardens don't have to have a style or a theme, but it can make it easier when you're grappling with deciding on things. What sort of paving do I use? What sort of fence will I put up? What sort of plants will I use? That sort of thing. It can help sometimes if you decide that you'd like to have your garden in a particular style, but it's not at all compulsory.
And native gardens, well, that one in the middle at the top there with the third one in from the left and right. That one.
That's native plants.
Initially, that didn't look like native plants at all to me, but it is. There's a fair bit of work in that, but you can formalise it if you want to. I was debating about whether we threw this slide in or not with these hedges, etc. I think that's a syzygium, but things like this, great spot hidey hole for finches. And in here, even a cat probably wouldn't be able to get a bird in there, which is ideal. So really, there's a fair bit of sanctuary in that. Although it's probably not my style, but
if you want to go formal, you can use native.
Still going to work, layered towards the outside, and layering is a major role in these things. But that fascinates me that it's all natives. I think someone's done an amazing job there.
So, yeah, so your garden can be messy and natural. It could be something really simple gravel with really architectural plants, sort of say a modern style thing. You can have clipped hedges and tidy paths. You can have a garden that's full of flowers and lots of colour. So a wildlife-friendly garden doesn't have to mimic nature.
Wildlife doesn't care.
And it can. The wildlife won't care.
Yeah.
Like they'll come if you provide water, food, habitat, nesting materials, protection from predators. They'll come. They'll be there.
Or any one, even just
one of those things will help to bring them in.
Absolutely. This is kind of the fun part where you can go through online.
It's all fun.
Magazines. Well, I love this. Well, you love this part too. But just flicking through and pulling parts out that you like, elements of design or features or plants. Doesn't have to be the whole shot. Can just be one plant, so that one, or whether it's this poppy or whatever it is, or these steps. You don't have to have the whole lot. And getting as more ideas in your head as you possibly can to put everything together and make a style that you're happy with.
And you might find that once you start doing this exercise, a bit of a theme starts to emerge, and you look at your collection of things that you like and you go, wow, you know, they're all
I'm an acacia lover.
I'm an acacia lover, or I do like things lined up. I seem to have a whole heap of photos of things that are lined up, or I really do like this natural garden look with rocks, because you seem to have collected a heap of photos that are like that. So it can help you make some decisions along the way by just sort of collecting images that you like. All right, this is a section that's so the elements of design are not so much physical things, but they're concepts and tools that you can use to give your garden design structure, and it helps you define spaces and functions. So we'll go through a few of those. There are several of them that are commonly used in garden design. One of those is focal points. And this is where you use an object or strategic placement of an object to lead your eye to a point or to an area. So, you know, using things like sculptures or striking trees, or even like this gap in the hedge down the bottom there is a focal point here. It's leading you down there, and it's making you want to go and see what's behind it.
Certainly want to go and have a look at the chooks on pipes over there. Is that what they are? They're awesome.
So examples of focal points can even be things like a large rock, or a water feature, or a really special tree that you want to highlight. Even
at night, it might be a underlit gum tree with lighting or something like that, just to bring your eye in and balance the garden.
So that's one tool you can use. Another one is symmetry. So by placing objects, plants in pairs, it immediately creates a little bit of formality in an otherwise irregular garden, like in that central photograph. Just those two pots have changed that from an asymmetrical garden. It's created a little bit of formality there, and leading you into the front entrance.
Leading you onto that path. We did that garden a few years ago, and it is quite a rambling garden, but it pulls you from the car to the path in this particular.
And then the focal point at the back there pulls you further into the garden.
So that's the idea. Now, look, all these look quite formal, and that's not the point here. It's more a matter of the talking about symmetry and balance that works to draw you through the garden.
And as a device to create interest. Repetition's another one of those things. So you can have things like avenues of trees. Once again, it could be plants or objects. It can be, you know, on a vertical plane or on the horizontal plane, like these timber steps through there, or below that picture, the vertical recycled timbers in a repetitive pattern. These big columns sort of creating an avenue down there, or you've got the same sort of effect up here with the trees creating a rhythm that you travel through as you're walking through the garden.
Even as small as these grasses. I love it.
Yeah, and repetition also sort of covers off on things like using multiples, so mass planting of things like grasses in particular lend themselves to mass planting.
Or a grove of she oaks.
A grove of she oaks, or a grove of little eucalypts or something like that.
Yeah.
Movements, another little element of design that's really useful. You can have compare these photographs. That the zigzag path compared to the curvy ones. It just creates a completely different feel. If you imagine that bluestone zigzag path had been laid as a curve, it would have created a quite different feel to that little garden. Or if this curvy path had been laid out on an angular pattern, it would have been a completely different feel as well. And then even comparing the curving path with the curving path through the grass, same sort of lines, but a completely different feel. Movement you can also bring in with moving objects in your garden.
Wouldn't that scare wildlife away?
Well, not really. Things like hanging CDs in your fruit trees, apparently that works a bit. I think they get used to them though.
I think
so. No, moving things don't tend to worry wildlife. And movement can also be things like wind chimes, those really groovy windmills that you can get these days, or make yourself.
Water.
Fountains. Yeah. Flags. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Create movement, create interest. So space and enclosure. This is where you can create different areas in your garden. So you can go from open and airy spaces to small and intimate spaces.
I like this because you can create rooms within your garden to a degree, but to build a room onto your house is quite an expensive process. But to put a room in your garden, not so. And I think that's an important way to be able to utilise your garden a lot more, is to create spaces that you can call a room as such, like parking spots like this. This is beautiful. Beautiful little area here to have a coffee, whatever. Not so much a room. I love that thing. That's amazing. But I agree. But I love the room.
And you can define those outdoor rooms or garden rooms simply by changing the floor surface, I guess, for example. So you can go from lawn to paving, and that is defining a space. And you can define and enclose things even more by putting half-height walls or full-height walls, or even a canopy or roof over the top. So you've got different levels of enclosure that you can create in your garden. So here's a few photos just illustrating a whole heap of the other things that you can take into account. So there's, contrasts in texture of leaves. So we've got long, skinny, sort of potentially spiky leaves, huge, big paddle-shaped leaves, fluffy grasses. We've got the different colours of the flowers. We've got the texture of the timbers and the gnarly logs. We've got shiny pots. You've got pebbles and rocks that all have different sorts of textures and shapes and colours and scale.
Some rusty corten or something like that as a feature.
And scent is another one of those things that is a wonderful thing to take into consideration when designing a garden, like putting a highly scented plant right near your, say, bedroom window so that the scent wafts in through the evening, or near your living room so it wafts in through the house. So sort of keeping those sorts of things in mind. So we're talking about, changing the floor surface to define an area, and you can sort of see with these examples that that's actually a very effective way, without even building any walls or any separations between spaces, is to create that sense of different areas within a garden just by changing the surface treatment on the ground level. So there's things like deck and sleepers, and someone's done a beautiful bit of mosaic. We saw that in an open garden a couple of years ago. The use of recycled bricks and gravel and the flat sort of slate rocks. So lots of different ways to treat your floors, including ground cover plants. Walls and fences, same sort of thing. Lots of different ways to do it. You can, very tall fences down to knee-height divisions. Your fences can be curvy or straight or soft or hard. They can use the materials that you've got at hand. So lots of different ways of separating one part of the garden from another, and separating your garden from the outside as well.
And not to mention protection too, so from the wind and screening.
Yes, so all these vertical elements can have many other uses.
We better wriggle on, or
We
we'll
better
be
wriggle
here
on.
all day.
Okay, furniture. Furniture is all the other stuff, so it doesn't just mean tables and chairs. It's all the other things you can put in, like seating, maybe a fire pit, pots, sculptures, fun things that you've made out of bicycle wheels, water bowls,
More fire
all the
pits.
stuff that you can sort of put in later on. And they actually function really well, a lot of them, as focal points or to provide the contrast in colour and shape and texture in your garden. So what have we got so far? So that's sort of the end of the information gathering, I guess. So what you've got now is some background information about your existing garden that you've compiled into a base plan. You've got
Knowledge.
about climates and the microclimates within your garden.
Notes.
Notes about views, aspects, circulation patterns and soil characteristics. You have lists of available resources. You've got a list of the functions your garden needs to provide.
You know how you want it to look.
And you've got a box of tools to help you develop and refine your design, those elements of design.
Finally, let's pull it together.
All right. So back to the base plan. So basically just grab your base plan, stick it down to a flat surface, and using baking paper.
Baking paper.
Yes, baking paper. So this is just the stuff you buy at the supermarket, not the greaseproof paper because you can't draw on that, but baking paper is great. It's much cheaper than buying a roll of tracing paper at an art supply shop. And as you can see through it and you can draw on it with a pencil. So basically, off you go. You start scribbling.
Oh, love the bubble diagrams.
Bubble diagrams. So using a pencil, you start loosely defining the areas and where you think they might need to be. So, for example, veggies and fruit in a sunny spot, bit of a scribble at the top corner there because I want to put some screening in to screen off the neighbour's backyard. We need an area to park the trailer, so that's kind of got to go over here near the road.
A little bit of lawn for the dog.
Bit of lawn for the dog. These bubbles can overlap and overflow into each other. Try lots of different combinations. I mean, it's a really good opportunity just using this butter paper or the baking paper to do layer and layer and layer and think a little bit outside the square. So, well, it sort of seems pretty obvious that this is where the cars have to go, but what if we put them over here instead?
It's
How does that change everything?
Yeah.
So it gives you a chance to try a whole heap of different combinations.
So you refine them from there.
And they get more and more detailed and more scribbling.
And this just looks like a mess to me.
Well, and it kind of is.
Yeah.
But then you go over and over and again. You can see that the sort of top photo, there's about 3 or 4 layers of different iterations of the same design where we've just moved things around and tried different things. And you can just keep doing this over and over again.
And the hardest thing for us is designing our own. We're really good at other people's, but we're still changing ours around after 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, so you do have to stop at some stage and come to a decision about what you're going to do and where you're going to put things.
It's a lot easier with someone else's garden than your own.
Yeah. But while you're doing all this, you're constantly keeping in mind and referring back to your functions and views, etc., all the things that you've made lists of and the things that are important. So eventually you end up with basically your final concept.
Or 2 or 3.
Or 2 or 3. So you might have a few different ones. Particularly for us, we like to go to our client with 2 or 3 different concepts so that we can then say to them, have a look at these, get back to us in a few days, and we'll talk about whether we use this bit from that plan and that bit from another plan and bring them together into one plan. So we didn't actually, with this particular garden, we didn't end up with a final plan because...
Well, that's basically it, but it didn't get constructed that way because we kept changing on
things.
The way. The client was a fabulous client that...
very flexible.
Was very flexible. We moved a few things around. So that's
and
always
that's what
the
happens
way.
with gardens. And that's the wonderful thing about gardens as well, is because they don't have to pass through a series of regulations and they don't have to be built to particular standards, You don't have to have your drawings all completely finished and accurate and signed off on. You can start and then you can change things as you go. So you don't have to put that tree exactly where it is on the plan that you've made a decision. You can move it. Doesn't matter. This is a guide. It's a tool for you to use.
I'd emphasise that, I mean, Michelle's an architect by trade, so this is particularly neat and quite detailed and quite complex with the areas of the zone, the elements.
But the next slide
that goes through.
Is even more so.
Yeah, exactly. This is another one. But look, designs like this enable you to get quotes for your construction, unless you're handy enough to do it yourself. But there are hard works on landscapes. If you want a water feature, you're going to need to get water to it. You want pavers. If you're not a paver, it can be a little tricky. It's better off just getting someone to do it once rather than them looking terrible in 2 or 3 years, timber slat fence, whatever it is that you're using. You can utilise a well-drawn plan to scale. It can be quoted off. And I think that's a pretty handy thing for enabling you to even bite off in chunks and do small steps. Can we talk about plants?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, finally. Finally. So plants are actually the most dominant element. So last but not least, that's for sure. So basically, once you've got your design worked out, it seems weird to be doing this without even drawing a plant on a plan. But they're in the back of your mind, and you do draw them on your sketches. But now's the time where you actually determine the categories of plants that you're going to need. So you look at your design. You say, well, I'm going to need small trees. We need some screening plants that'll grow 2.5 to 3 metres high. We want ground covers. We need some water plants for around the pond. So you get an idea of the sort of categories of plants.
You need some grasses for the finches that come in over the back fence,
yeah.
etc.
So then you start creating lists and doing research and talking to your local nurseries and looking at the Garden for Wildlife book and making lists of plants that will fit into those categories. And then you can choose the individual plants to go in each spot in your garden. So once again, I tend to do layer upon layer, and this is where the baking paper comes in handy as well, to organise yourself, your planting layout, and place your trees on your plan, and then, you know, put the shrubs in around them and your grasses and ground covers. And this is where one of my favourite parts.
Just getting a bit aware of our time here, so we're just better move along.
We're nearly there.
We are nearly there.
Okay. Researching plants can be done with books, online, go to your local nurseries. You see something you like in a garden, take a photo of it, and then find out what it is.
Or you see it in the bush, take a photo of it. There's some amazing stuff out there.
I'm sure I drive our local nurseries a little bit crazy because I tend to see things in the bush or look them up in a local field guide of plants and ask them, can you grow this for me? Can I get this? And they just go, no.
We spend half our life between places, getting out of the car, running through the scrub, trying to identify something that we drove past.
And a lot of native plants, Indigenous plants, are very hard to propagate.
So can I just jump in there, because that is, sorry, just very briefly, that's a really pertinent point in relation to the booklet, because we've been very aware of that in terms of the Indigenous species guides that tend to be out there that are, you know, wonderful, but then people get disheartened because they try and reach out to from their nurseries to buy those species, and they're just virtually impossible to propagate. So that's one thing that we have focused very heavily on in the booklet, is making sure that every species listed is locally available.
No, yeah. That's great.
And that's an important point, because there are things like native cherry or cherry ballart that's
it's parasitic.
It's pretty much a parasite. Well, it grows. It doesn't so much kill another tree, but it grows off their roots. So they're a lovely looking little tree, but you can't really buy it. And a lot of people do, you know, request something like that. So,
but the great thing, you know, aside from that, once you start putting the plants that you can get hold of and that are commercially viable for nurseries to grow, once you start that and the wildlife comes in, they will then bring in seed and, you know, propagating with bits and pieces that will grow from, you know, roots and things in your own garden. So you may well end up with something like a cherry ballart that comes in as a seed, and ends up
attaching itself
to a tree in your garden, for example, or other things, native plants that grow from seed might end up in your garden being brought in by the wildlife.
Or weeds.
Or weeds, yes.
You need to be able to identify the best you can.
Okay, this is nearly the last slide.
All right.
This is your baby.
Okay. You've got a lot of work to do. Look, sometimes it's a bit overwhelming when you look at the final plan and see what you've got there. To be able to get your head around it, it's really good if you wanted to. And can I flick through to the final? Oh, I can't really, there's not one there. Start at the furthest part away from your house and work out, away from your driveway and the access. And if you think of a landscape on a profile that's looking sideways, you go to the deepest point, which is probably going to be electrical work or plumbing, anything under the ground, footings for your gazebo. Work your way up from that regard. And look, we're just about to lose a bit of battery here, so
It's all under control.
It's all under control. But that's how I work with it, from the ground or underground up, and from the furthest access point away from the driveway out. So if that makes sense. All right.
So here
Final.
we are again. So basically, hopefully, hasn't been too overwhelming and confusing, but back to the same slide as we started with, and that's how we managed to go from the situation at the top to the situation at the bottom. Of course, that's when all the hard work starts.
It begins. Anyway, look, that's really the end of our presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope we didn't make it too complex or too rambling. Anyway,
thanks for watching.
And thanks for watching. I'll go back to you, Liza.
Thank you so much. That's just wonderful. And it's just the nature of the beast. There is complexity to this process. And you've done a wonderful breakdown for everyone. And it's very telling that it's on us. We got our timing wrong in terms of how things would run, but it's very telling that virtually all guests are still with us viewing it. So thanks very much to everyone. And I think that speaks very highly of the power of the presentation, Drew and Michelle. So thank you so much. And we will just continue. So for those who need to leave, that's absolutely fine. But we're now going to go to the video I spoke of earlier from Wadawangara, and then we'll come back to a generalised Q&A, which could be about anything, could be the booklet, the video, or questions directly to Drew and Michelle. And the way we'll run that is by either you can put your hand up if you'd like to do the hand symbol, if you know where that is, and it's generally at the top of screen, depending on what device you're on. And we'll throw to you to ask the question directly, or you can just pop it in the chat and I'll read it out for whoever it's directed towards. So now over to you, Joanne, the president of the Wadawangara Landcare Group. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Liza, and thanks for this opportunity to speak. Wadawangara Landcare was fairly moribund for several years. We reconstructed ourselves, and to our surprise, in September of last year, got a Colac Otway Shire community grant for weed control along the Otway coast. It was a very short timeline. We had to have it all finished by July of this year, and we did. But the real issue for us was the pandemic. And because we didn't have a history, we didn't know how things should be done, and that was probably a really great thing. We had to use social media to engage with our members and with our community. We got our working bees done very spontaneously. Suddenly there was no lockdown. People were here. We give people 2 days notice and they would show up. So we got all that done in terms of the money that we were provided with, but we had to make an in-kind contribution, which was around community education. How could we do that when we couldn't meet with our community? We had the idea of producing a video with the amazing Jen Wood, who is watching this, I know, one of our great members. And one of the lessons from this is that volunteer groups really should look at their membership. There's a huge skill base there, and people just have to feel okay about putting up their hand and saying, I can do that. Jen put hours and hours and hours during lockdowns to creating the video that you're about to see, which is to encourage volunteers, many of whom have full-time jobs and a lot of time, to take control of their own properties, so to speak. Think about their backyards as being the bush, which they are. Think about managing weeds that we don't want to focus on too much. And think about replanting. In our case, our big focus is fire-resistant plants. There is another publication which we've produced with COS that you can look at that, because of course we've all had terrible experience of bushfire. So I'll leave it to Liza to show the video, which you'll be happy to hear runs for less than 4 minutes, but we hope it's really useful for other land care groups to think about how they can reach out to their community in this way.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, I think it's a fantastic inspirational piece of work, and my favourite element, I have to say, is the fact that the gorgeous birdsong and natural sounds that you hear in the background are actually true to life. That's not a soundtrack. That was recorded as part of the process of the video. So we've actually called in Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and we've actually called in a bit of a tech expert because we were having some streaming problems when it came to the video. So now I'm going to throw to Julian. Thanks so much to please take over and make it work for us.
There's no sound, Liza.
Yeah, there's no sound, Julian. Apologies, or we've had a bit of some serious technical issues. In fact, a bit would be an understatement in relation to getting the video to work online, but hopefully we'll have it happening now. Maybe it's because you're on mute, Julian. Like your actual, mic'd, yeah.
But on and around our properties are things that don't belong. These weedy plants can run wild, creating problems for the creatures that live in this ancient. We love our beautiful Otway with its ancient coastline and towering forests, but on and around our properties are things that don't belong. These weedy plants can run wild, creating problems for the creatures that live in our bushland and our waterways. So we'd like to show you how to recognise and remove these plants. Pampas grass looks handsome with its fine feathery flower heads, but don't be fooled. It grows in large clumps with long, sharp blades. Its density restricts the movement of animals and makes it a real fire hazard. Getting this weed early in its spread is the best way to control it. For small clumps, you can truss them up using strong twine and dig them out with a mattock. Sweet Pittosporum is an Australian native tree, but it doesn't belong in the Otways. Its broad, oily leaves are highly flammable, and its large stands shade the forest floor, preventing the growth of smaller native plants, making it hard for the creatures that live there to find a feed. To deal with smaller patches, either dig them out or cut and immediately paint them with a suitable herbicide. The asparagus fern looks delicate and attractive. You might see it used in a flower bouquet. But in the bush, it chokes out native plants by twisting and climbing all over them. To get rid of asparagus fern, you need to cut around the crown of the plant and pull it out. As long as you remove the rhizome completely, the asparagus fern won't regrow. And remember to pick up any berries left behind so the birds don't spread them through the bush. Some folks leave their blackberries to grow wild because they're delicious. But it's also a super aggressive weed blanketing large parts of Victoria. Spraying blackberry patches is common practice. But why not get to work with your trusty mattock? Carefully cut the blackberry down to the base. Then stick your mattock under the crown and lever it out. Goats love blackberries too. But they won't eat blue periwinkle because it's mildly poisonous to them. And it's no good for dogs or kids either. Blue periwinkle is a perennial herb with long creeping strands. It carpets the bushland and smothers the local native vegetation. Simply dig out smaller patches with your favourite shovel or use a suitable spray on larger ones. So when you're imagining what to plant in that nice patch of earth you've just cleared, why not consider an Indigenous garden that's beautiful and fire resistant? Our native creatures will thank you.
Yeah, isn't it brilliant? And thanks so much to Julian for the technical assistance to display that, because that was quite a challenge for us. Yeah, I think based on the claps I just saw on screen, yeah, it just goes to show how a truly incredible thing. Like, that is time not wasted in lockdown. You know, we've often spoken about how it feels like a bit of a hiatus on life, but something like that to me is very inspirational in terms of what can be done when we can't even meet up with each other properly. So we've clearly run seriously beyond time, but as I said before, we'll do a 10-minute Q&A on general questions to anyone, and then we'll call it quits at the end of our launch, which has been, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I feel very excited by the ideas that have been raised, many of which stretch beyond the booklet. You know, there's only so much you can contain in 64 pages, but yeah, it's just all very exciting. We've got Dora with her hand up. Yes, please, Dora.
Myself, yes. All I just wanted to add that especially on the back of the video and the talk of being able to do that during lockdowns and pandemics. In terms of gardening, you know, getting out there, doing the gardening is a great way to support your well-being and mental health while we're all isolated or in lockdown. And it's also creating Indigenous gardens is also a great way to make your gardens more climate change resilient. You know, the local Indigenous plants are very much adopted to the climatic conditions and have the ability to adapt well. So it will make for longevity and a sustainable garden. They're often drought tolerant. As Joanne said as well, there's lots of opportunities for fire safe gardens with native plants. So some of those other considerations and other benefits of native gardening, Indigenous gardening, I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention. Thanks, Liza.
Thanks, Dora. Do we have any questions to presenters? Comments? Yep. Uh-oh. Over to you, Joanne, and then Teresa, I'll come to you second. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Just quickly, I wanted to add, we don't think the pandemic's over. We don't know how long it's going to go on for. We could be operating like this for years, and that's the reality. So Wangara Landcare is going to continue operating this way for years, and I think that's an important thing for those who are landcare groups to understand. There's got to be a whole new paradigm for making things happen. How things worked in the past ain't how they're going to work in the future, but it doesn't mean that good things can't happen as we move forwards carefully.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, very well stated. I've just had a couple of questions come in on the chat about access to the booklet. So I'm just posting now the link to the electronic version of the booklet. I hope, oh, it didn't seem to come up. All right, I'll need to relink that, but I'll relink that very shortly so it'll be accessible to everyone. But also, I'll put my email address in the chat. So if you would like a hard copy, we can send that out. If you just email me with a subject title Garden for Wildlife booklet, we're very happy to get that to everybody. As part of, as Joanne said, like ideally we wouldn't want to be using extra paper to wrap things up and post it out, but we just have to adapt to what is likely to be our norm for some time to come.
Liza, also the link is further up in the chat if people scroll up.
Yeah, I just tried to it just didn't work. I'll just put it back down here now. I think it'll work now. It just didn't work before. So save people scrolling. There it is now. Yep, I think it's come through. Does anyone see it?
No, just your email. The next one hasn't come through yet.
Okay, I'm sure it'll come through shortly. So we're going to go to Teresa for her question. If you can unmute yourself, that'd be great.
Oh dear.
Okay, so it seems you have two windows open, so that's the problem. You've got feedback because you've logged in twice. So if you could mute, yeah, I think it would be. Oh, okay. She's gone. Maybe she'll come back in. I was going to suggest that she just posted the question. All good. Anyone else like to ask or comment on anything? Okay, here we have a question through the chat. Thanks, Erin. So this is one for you, Drew and Michelle. Is there any solution to wind tunnels on a property? Is there a way to build a wildlife corridor that also blocks the wind?
Absolutely, absolutely. It doesn't matter what you block the wind with, preferably plants, but there's no reason why you can't plant across any wind tunnels, and it's not hard, and it doesn't actually take that long to block the wind. And I would be going again, if you've got the room, it's the space that's probably the only limiting factor on that, is how much distance you've got before you start getting too close to the building. But again, a layered effect is usually the best way to go. Under, middle and top story. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great. I guess similarly, and this was one of the aspects that we were hoping to put into the booklet, but weren't able to due to just space constraints and just the enormity of content that we could potentially have included, was in relation to effluent fields and how difficult it is to, like, we were going to include a species list of, appropriate species for that, but how difficult is it to successfully manage, from your experience, effluent field planting?
What do you mean by effluent field?
So from in the unserviced communities where you've got the septic tanks and then the field of discharge.
Yeah. I might leave. This is a tricky one because I can give you advice and you might end up blocking it all up and having to get the plumber in and replacing it. Yeah. So we tend to give them quite a wide berth unless they're on our own property. And then we take our own risk. But really, the overflow from your septic is literally just under the ground, just under your feet, within 300 or 400 mil. you're best to avoid it if you can. If you need to block that out, try and give it 3 or 4 metres, and something like a bottle brush or callistemons or whatever, a pretty good alternative. It doesn't have to be mass planted. Even anything will work, but you might want to consider root barrier, which is a fairly expensive way, but very, very effective way to keep the roots out of that septic
And if
system.
you want to plant on top of that space, shallow rooted things like your grasses and
ground covers,
ground cover sorts of things.
And they'll all work, but you won't sort of screen with that. But anything shallow rooted is going to be okay.
But with the shallow roots, you should be fine in terms of without the root, the barriers or anything else. Like just those really shallow rooted, kind of wet, happy with wet feet, tussocks and grasses.
Yeah,
the way to go.
Yeah. Warrigal greens are another good one. So,
yeah.
Oh, the native spinach.
Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't probably eat it if it's on
I
the septic,
probably wouldn't eat it by principle, but it's a good green.
Also, your local council's environmental health team usually can provide you with a list of plants that are suitable for effluent fields. So that's a good way to access that information and make sure your effluent field still complies with the regulations, as well as being able to plant over them if you want to do that, because they can take up quite a big space in your garden, as you would know.
Yep. So strange to end after all of the beautiful plants and animals talk on effluent fields, but unless anyone has a final question, going. We've got 20 seconds for a final question. Otherwise, we'll call it a day.
Joanne,
is that you, Joanne?
Yeah, just wanted to make a point about effluent fields. There is an excellent publication on the COS website about planting out, and certainly here where we all lost our effluent fields in the fire, we're pretty keen to replant them with stuff like, I can see out my window, and Yvonne could also add, hop gardenia, the native sedges, prickly moses. The effluent fields are a really critical environment for wildlife, and we can't afford to leave them empty. It's easy to find out about shallow-rooted plants that actually suck up water, which is what they need to do. It's very disappointing for us when people don't plant on their effluent fields when the information is available. I can send you that link if you don't have it, Lisa, because I've sent it to a lot of people. It actually is on your website, but it's hidden away.
I think it would be great if you add it to the chat. That would be brilliant, because I think more what Michelle and Drew were speaking to then was more in relation to your more rural properties, where it's quite a different landscape to the fields in somewhere more densely populated like Y, where the infrastructure is quite different and it's more robust in terms of those other plants being able to populate those areas.
Not enough to be an advisor on planting, that's for sure. It sounds like, Joanne, you've got the information at hand, which is great. Yeah.
I'll have to find it, but yes.
Great. Well, thank you once again for everyone for your attendance. I hope you've enjoyed our launch of our booklet, and hopefully there will be some point in the future where we can meet in person and do the plant giveaway, which we had planned, which was going to be a full range of species from the booklet to our communities to really help sort of drive the initial excitement about getting it out there. But I think I found it super enjoyable. I hope everyone else has, and I really appreciate everybody logging in thanks. I'm getting heaps of thumbs up. That's awesome. Thanks. And thank you so much to our presenters, everyone who's spoken, and in particular to Michelle and Drew, who at unbelievably short notice put together the extraordinary presentation you saw. That's quite amazing.
And the link is in the chat to the booklet online. So those of you that want to access it, the link is there now. Hopefully it will work for you. Otherwise, email us.
And the exciting thing is we've got this great network across the state. So literally the two edges of the state, we now have a great environmental network with. So I think that will benefit everyone going forward.
Joanne put in the links for the effluent fields too. Well done, Joanne.
Oh, you found that fast?
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Brilliant.
lovely day.
Thank you.